Hello and welcome to the Athena 40 podcast, Bouncing Back. I'm Elizabeth Filippouli, founder of Athena 40, an international platform promoting female leadership and connecting individuals from around the world to exchange knowledge and insights. In this podcast series, we are interviewing thought leaders, entrepreneurs, and decision makers. We're bringing you insights related to developments triggered by the coronavirus crisis, and we speak with pioneering women from across different industries and countries. Today, I'm interviewing Kalypso Nikolaidis, Professor of International Relations at the University of Oxford. Kalypso has written on various aspects of international relations and global governance, as well as internal and external aspects of European integration. Her work focuses on the reform of global governance, issues of identity, justice, and cooperation in the international system. Kalypso, a pleasure to speak to you today.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
I was reading a very interesting article on how COVID-19 has divided people into 6 categories. Those who have not been infected, those who have been infected but are not diagnosed, those who have tested positive, those who have recovered from the virus, those who require treatment, and those who have died from it. I would add a 7th category, those who suffer from other conditions and may have lost access to medical care because of the COVID-19 crisis. And I wonder, how democratic is that? And of course, what is the impact of this crisis on democracy?
Well, this is a very complex, multifaceted question. And one of the fascinating thing about this crisis, Elizabeth, isn't it, is that it's like a mega social experiment across the world. We have 5 billion people in different states of lockdown, dozens of governments, societies, trying to find ways of dealing with this virus. And in some ways, I call this phenomenon the social appropriation of R. You know, R, the reproduction rate between of the virus, and everyone is focused on whether it will be above 1 or under 1, and we're all collectively aiming for under 1. So what matters in this story is whether not so much the edicts, the orders from above, but really what you and I and everybody else does on their everyday life, their social behavior, whether they internalize what they need to do to keep this R down. And then the second degree, watching the results of what we're doing and watching each other, watching across countries. And so in this story, then the question you ask is about, democratic resilience. What kind of ground and soil is more propitious to fighting back, as it were? And so it's interesting, the categories that you give, all of us kind of play with different types of categories to the extent that people are more or less vulnerable. And I think that when you speak about your 7th category, people who suffer from other conditions, and maybe they're afraid to go to the hospitals, or there are no resources for them, they're not diagnosed, and all of that, this speaks to the fact that these vulnerabilities are more or less visible, more or less attended to, and maybe to the very first function of our democracies, which is to include the demos, all of us, the multitude. That's kind of the point. Contrary, Elizabeth, I know you're in Athens right now, and of course we may be proud, we who are Greeks, or like me, half Greek, that our country so-called invented democracy, and it did in many ways. But the other thing it did was to exclude people, women, foreigners, slaves. And so what we've learned over the last few centuries in a very flawed manner is that democracy is inclusive. But something like this pandemic tests the limits, tests the areas where it hasn't quite succeeded. And whether it's economically, politically, socially, there's still a long way to go in our awareness of these lines of inclusion and exclusion, these borders.
Mm-hmm. You have written, Kalypso, that we had risks which we expected to be controllable because they were calculable. And that nurtured the evolution of welfare states, where the nation states were obligated to protect its citizens from all types of dangers and insecurities. That was the expectation. That was the ideal. But what we have seen now is that this welfare state is gone. We have seen it collapsing, and that collapse has been happening in front of our very eyes during this crisis. Is it because the risks have transformed?
Well, to some extent, absolutely the risks have transformed, because partly governing is about trying to make probability assessments, like living actually, will it rain this afternoon? Should I take an umbrella? So, but today we're in a situation where governments around the world, which are more or less strong, can't make these assessments. Originally, we all thought, oh, the scientists, they have a magic wand, they'll give us a number. But they don't know either. But we're learning as we go along. Now, I'm not sure we can say that the welfare state has disappeared, but it has been shaken. But Elizabeth, isn't it true that it was very shaken, of course, in the years before, including with the financial crisis in Europe? And what we have is a system that has produced what my friend Albina Azmanova called, a generalized system of precarity for the multitude. Not so much inequality, yes, that's true too, but something more profound is that many of us, even if we're not especially badly off, even us, we are more precarious. Our children are more precarious. We don't know if we will be protected against adversity. And that is because, of course, we live in a capitalist system where firms do whatever they want, but people who don't move, people who live somewhere are much more vulnerable, and the welfare state has less and less resource to attend to these people, obviously. So the key for all of us now is to deal with this precarity, not just the precariat, as Standing would say, like a class of people, but all of us as a society, that we better assess risk. And that means that governments should feel not just responsive to the short-term cries, but responsible for the long term.
I agree with you that there were some weaknesses and fragilities in the system, in the systems rather, which have been perhaps dating back a few decades ago, and we were either ignoring them or we were trying to patch them up. For example, for quite some time now, the European Union has been battling with such weaknesses, and according to some, it has been an existential crisis altogether over the last perhaps 10 years. So in many ways, everything that could go wrong has gone wrong, from the economic crisis that started in 2010 and was followed by the refugee and the Brexit crisis, reinforcing skepticism around unity, integration, solidarity, and whether Mother Europe, or the European Union rather, is in a position to care for all its citizens equally and efficiently. So now, what we have seen happening during the crisis is this centralized system, which we were thinking as being the ideal to protect collaboration, partnership, and a unified approach to the policies across the various verticals. It was gone. So each state, each country had to close their borders and to see how it will protect its citizens to the best of the judgment of each prime minister. Do you see the European Union being affected by the crisis in its perhaps purpose?
I would say it's too early to tell. And we've just seen, Elizabeth, something that many of us thought we would never see, which is a declaration by Macron and Merkel that we will enter the world of joint debt, that the Commission, representing the EU, will raise debt and disperse it to countries, and that will not be reimbursed as loans. That's a very new world. Now, we're not there yet, but it's a major switch. So yes, you're absolutely right that at the beginning, it was dismal for all of us pro-Europeans to see what you described, the closing of borders. No, I will not export my masks or whatever it was. But let's remember that the EU has no competence in health, or very little, a bit of coordination. So this whole crisis landed on a terrain that was very hard for the EU. And indeed, it actually tried to quickly, and now we're getting there, do what it does when it doesn't really have, its own competence, which is to supply tables. To some extent, the EU is an engine that supplies tables around which representatives of member states sit and agree and try to do things together. So now we're indeed trying to cooperate more on research, and also on supply of PPE, and more generally trying to build some sort of health response at the EU level. But the much more important leg of EU activity is, of course, economic. And as we know from the Greek experience, the first bit of that is to tell countries what they can't do. You can't have a big budget deficit, Athens was told year after year. Well, suddenly the first action of the EU was to lift that constraint. So you could say, well, it's a bit ironic. The biggest thing the EU did to start with is to say, I won't coerce you anymore, try to tell you what not to do. And that was important because we've seen all of our member states take out their fiscal bazooka in supporting their economy, and we will see which one will be most successful. But as I started my answer, we're now in a new phase where the EU is exploring different ways of providing funds through EU budget, through the European Investment Bank, through the monetary system, etc. But also exploring the new frontier that we've all been kind of waiting for. It's not quite the Eurobond, but we're getting there. And that's, Elizabeth, I think a sign that there is a sense of solidarity. We could also say enlightened self-interest, because of course Germany has no interest in seeing the weakening of this Eurozone, which has made it so rich. It's the biggest beneficiary. But on the other hand, there is an element of solidarity that has been slightly more, easier than during the financial crisis, because this old argument that we Greeks really know about, this whole moral hazard argument, is kind of gone when there's a crisis. This is a shock that has a symmetric underlying cause, even if it has asymmetric impact, especially on Mediterranean country. But you can't say it's our fault in Italy or in Spain if we got hit especially hard. Maybe it's because, well, we have more generations living with each other, different social habits and all the rest of it. It's not because of a profligate government. So this moral hazard argument about the frugal ants, anyway, it doesn't really hold anymore, and it was becoming untenable. And this is in part because economics is always a moral science, that we're seeing some movement in the EU. And I have to admit that for the first time in a very long time, I'm actually pretty optimistic.
You're optimistic about Europe and the European Union?
I'm optimistic about the capacity of this very, very slow, cumbersome machine to come up with decisions. And that's what we're seeing now in the economic realm. We're seeing a whole package of actions which are pretty amazing in the grander scheme of things. The EU creating various funds for the pandemic, the European Central Bank lifting some of its past constraint when it was doing quantitative easing. Now it's going to do it, but even without the limits that it had set itself before. We are seeing movement, and I do feel that there is a quality to this crisis, if I can use that word, that is different from before. The idea of a common enemy, this tiny virus that is common in Europe and in the world, somehow focuses the mind. So yes, I'm actually quite optimistic about what is happening in Europe. Mm-hmm. I know you're surprised. Are you yourself much more negative?
No. I was about to say that I am with you, because I think that shared trauma and tragedy imprint on populations, and that common suffering can be directed towards collective benefit. And I do think that there is a tremendous opportunity here for solidarity and collaboration. And of course, any global catastrophe, as long, of course, as humanity survives, it provides opportunities for individuals, organizations, societies, and of course civilizations as a whole to assess things and to restart. So we can do a number of different restarts on various levels. And I think for the European Union as well is a great opportunity to assess its weaknesses, to see the gaps, and to demonstrate that it has been created for a reason. And now we are all together repositioning that raison d'etre.
Indeed. And I also think that we are repositioning, that we, it will be very tempting to go back to the old normal. That's what humans do, like elastic, in our individual behavior, in the EU's approach. But exactly as you described, this is not the same as before. But I would add something there, which is that Europe here and European democracy is not about necessarily just, doing more at the European level, that too, but there is something that's emerging, a kind of understanding, I think, among us that, human beings live in some sort of circles of autonomy, circles where they can sustain autonomy. So if you think of you and your household, your family in your flat or in your house, or your neighborhood where people help each other, well, that's a circle of autonomy. But then in every country, there is a debate about what level should we decide, what our vulnerabilities are and what our capacity to address them are. In France, there's this whole debate about region versus region, in the US, state versus state. In Greece too, there are regions, and regions, they're within their cities. And so part of the image of the world that, I've always kind of supported, but is becoming clearer with the virus, is that working together is about, it's not some sort of vertical thing. It's about horizontally connecting these circles. So if one is more vulnerable at one point, it's helped by another circle. And then might be a bigger circle bringing them together. And in a way, in France, we talk about the fight between the Girondins and the Jacobins. And, it's the Girondins, it's the, those who believe in multi-centric governance, who I think are winning the day, because that's how we will fight the virus in all sorts of different sizes of circles of solidarity and circles of autonomy.
You're talking about circles, and I was having a conversation with some international students based around the world, and we were discussing those challenges and of course opportunities emerging from COVID-19 crisis. And I was saying that I see 5 main areas where we have positive potential. So thought production, we have now a fantastic opportunity for new thinking, new ideas. There's new inspiration at the heart of this tragedy. Then another area is our economy. We can focus on or refocus on the areas that need support. And of course, development, growth, prosperity, these are our priorities. Society. We need good governance, we need well-functioning democracies and institutions. Now is the time to assess what went right, what went wrong, and how we can fix our vulnerabilities. And then, of course, the 2 areas of well-being, happiness, balance, health. We are going to see, as you know, a significant increase in mental health issues because of this tragedy, the threat, this tiny invisible enemy which has placed our lives, in danger. And then spirituality and self-purpose, that's giving us the opportunity through catastrophe and suffering to reach new levels of perhaps a profound catharsis, to refer to the Greek term, and that catharsis usually accompanies major upheavals. So the potential for positive change across those various circles is huge.
And of course, it's as big as your imagination or mine imagination. And the list you just gave, Elizabeth, is, in a way, is absolutely something we all share in hope. And then the question is, and when you added well-being, I was thinking of Arianna Huffington and all her work in that area, which is so important. And part of the thing here is that we're coming back to your very first comment at the beginning of our conversation about the excluded. And so kind of a collective rethinking about access to well-being, to resources for well-being, mental and physical resources. And I think part of our societies could be reoriented this way. But I said could because what I find in this crisis, and I think you and I share this, is that people are projecting their worst nightmare and their greatest dreams and desires to this future, to the after. And it happens like this when you're in a crisis and you survive it. And I think that, we need to be so well aware that, of course, hope is not optimism. In fact, it's almost the opposite. In spite of pessimism, I am hopeful. And if that's the case, then none of all of this rethinking, which is so important, will happen without agency, without groups of people saying together, we will make this happen. And of course, the problem of social distancing is that democracy, requires crowds. It requires people being close to each other, if not necessarily hugging, but you can't demonstrate or meet or whatever, all the good things we do in democracy. Although, there was this wonderful picture in Israel of people demonstrating at 2 meters apart. It was kind of eerie. But the question is whether we will, as democracies, see people working together. How in this new context? I mean, can you really virtually, mobilize all of this? Now, of course, some of what you're saying is not necessarily linked directly to political action, economic reorganization, but all of it needs, in some ways or another, for people to be vigilant. So I'm very much hoping that when we're all relieved because this eases down, we will stay vigilant. Across borders too. And perhaps that's where the technology that we're using now, will make a difference, because suddenly we can organize meetings, discussions, deliberations across borders with automatic translations and all sorts of things, across people, teachers across borders. And you were talking of students, well, we are at the forefront of teaching across borders, but I think bits of society, especially in Europe, can learn to really mobilize together across border and stay vigilant.
Calypso, thank you very much for this conversation today. And I wish you the best during this crisis, but also, of course, after this whole ordeal starts easing, or hopefully ends sometime soon. And I wish you the best in your new endeavors, which begin as of the end of this year.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. And I want to say that I'm very much thanking you and what we are doing together, including for women leaders, with women leaders. Also, I feel for my compatriots in Greece. Here I am sitting in Oxford. And indeed, I very much hope that our students across the world that you were referring to will be the ones, to above all lead us in the new phase that we're all hoping for.
I am sure they will. I am sure that, younger people are taking many lessons from this crisis, and they will demonstrate more visionary and more accountable leadership, which is what our world needs. Thank you, Calypso. And thank you for listening to the Athena 40 podcast, Bouncing Back. Stay tuned. More episodes coming up. Please feel free to subscribe. Athena 40 is hosting conversations with thought leaders, entrepreneurs, influencers, and decision makers from all over the world in this effort to find our new normal. You can find more information on us on athena40forum.com and follow us on Twitter on Athena_40. Stay safe, stay inspired.